I wanted to introduce this next panel, which is called Instruments of the Black Gooey Universe. And that title comes from an essay that I wrote in part of a class that I taught called Black Gooey Universe. And Instruments of the Black Gooey Universe has been an attempt to think about critical theory around computation in relationship to hardware and what we make out of this idea, which hopefully will come out a little bit in the conversation. But School for Poetic Computation has done this residency, part of the Kitchens Lab residency, over the last year. And through that time, 4 researchers were able to investigate the Kitchens archive and think about things they found in the archive alongside this theme of instruments in the Black Gooey universe. And so today we have Danny Brito, who was working at the Kitchen, facilitating this residency, who will be moderating the panel, and the researchers who are Fields Harrington, Romy Morrison, Lillian Yvonne Bertram, and Aisha Tamarisa. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome them to the stage.
First, we'll start with Fields Harrington, who will present a bit about his work while at the Kitchen.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Fields Harrington. I'm just going to be honest. I'm going to be reading, and this presentation will be an accumulation of loose notes and fragmented thoughts.
I show musicians how to interpret symbolism. What they do with it is up to them. But basically, they are embellishing this information when I go like that, or elaborating on it, or varying it, or inverting it. I mean, they're not improvising a development. They're taking something very specific and they're developing it. You with me? You with me? Please, I want to know that I'm going to take you on this journey. When I say develop this idea, I'm not interested in a free improvisation because that's not what this means. This means to develop something very specific. When I go like this, okay. Don't play. This means to yield, by the way. It just means to pay attention. I'm going to give you some information. That's the information. Come on, ready? Ready? I'll tell you when. That's the information. That's it. That's the information. So when I go like this, they're free to develop that on their own. On their own. When I go back, you see what I mean? Okay, now we're going to take that information, we're going to take it out. And we're going to do it like this.
This clip is from a YouTube video that was published online in 2016, but the recording happened in 2007 at the San Francisco Jazz Center. Larry Oakes from the Rova Saxophone Quartet organized an octet of string players to demonstrate Butch Morris's system of conduction. The occasion was one of a series of discussions with improvisers presented by Rover Arts. When looking at the scientific definition of conduction, it is described as the process by which heat energy is transmitted through collisions between neighboring atoms or molecules, or as the transfer of heat through matter by communication of kinetic energy from particle to particle, with no net displacement of the particles, while taking place in all phases, solid, liquid, and gas. However, when Butch Morris employed the method he termed conduction, it's the physical aspect of communication and heat. It's the inhabiting of an extra dimension of notation and improvisation. Its interpretation in real time, it disrupts our notion of what it means to be a conductor, a composer, improviser, and a listener. It's the electricity that flows between conductor and musician. It's symbolic of notation, just like speech is symbolic of writing, and it is the art of collective imagination. When thinking and encountering the history of Butch Morris' work in the Kitchen's archive, and I often think about absence, how the absence of a technique enabled Morris to lead, conduct, and orchestrate instrumentalists, and the absence of a method that prompted him to invent a new grammar, a new vocabulary, and language of sonic orchestration. So some questions that I have for his practice is, how is language inscribed into his gestures? Throughout my residency with the SFPC, the Simons Foundation, and the Kitchen, I wanted to know if there was a scientific value of Butch Morris's gestural articulation of conduction. Is there an economy of his movement? And this can be any movement when we think about Morris, the movement of his baton, the movement of sonic information being produced, or the movement of his arrangements produced by his ensembles. How does inhabiting an extra dimension of notation and improvisation constitute a new grammar, vocabulary, and a new social logic? After 12 years of research, Butch Morris debuted his first chronological conduction at the Kitchen on February 1st in 1985. The performance, titled Current Trends in Racism in Modern America, A Work in Progress. The performance featured Brandon Ross on guitar, Zena Parkins on harp, Thurman Baker on marimba, Curtis Clark on piano, Frank Lowe on tenor saxophone, Christian Marclay on turntables, Eli Fountain on the vibraphone, Isona Tone on voice, Tom Cora on cello, and John Zorn on alto saxophone in the game calls. In the press release of the performance, we are given a glimpse of Morris's conceptual frame. A conduction is a conducted improvisation. In essence, it is an improvised duet for ensemble and conductor, prose, communion, a melding of minds. But from an epistemological ground, Morris was producing a local knowledge system that breaks from outside and within, or more precisely, what the press release describes as a system that is a unit, an individual conscious of its own unity. He invented a sonic instruction set that consisted of signs and gestures to transmit information to his ensembles. For Morris, there was a lack of terminology, notations that didn't exist in conducting and also didn't exist in improvisation. This notational scarcity prompted him to develop a deeper vocabulary of ideographics, symbolism, and directives that would transfuse generative information for interpretation in a real-time content structure exchange. He desired to exploit and manipulate notation through conducted improvisation. So I believe this quote from Carrie Nolan's book, Agency and Embodiment, Performing Gestures and Producing Culture, leans into the position that I want to take when thinking about Butch's gestural articulation and the embodied knowledge that he produces with the invention of conduction. And I won't read the entire quote, but something that really stands out to me is that how gestures are a type of inscription, a parsing of the body into signifying or operational units, kind of similar to how Morris talked about what he thought conduction was in his press release at the Kitchen. Conduction is a gestural lexicon that developed over time. Its meaning shifted weight through time and space, marked by a language that was invented out of necessity. Is there an economy of this necessity? Is there an economy of Morris's gestures and sign? Is the time-space of Morris's lexicon of gestures in relation to or a site of politics? What does the repetition of Morris's gestures look like without accumulation? How does conduction become an embodied dialogue? How does it become an embodied correspondence between conductor and musician? I'm not interested in understanding the efficiency and management of Morris's gestures, and I'm not, and of his signs with these questions. I'm also not thinking about the commerce or the financial conditions of his gestures and signs. I'm invested in trying to know how Morris gestures become inscriptive and have the volume to script, to write and to transcribe sonic information. Perhaps there's a concern with the intentional use and development of his gestures to convey meaning, communicate non-verbally, construct a ground for spontaneous collective intimacy, bring attention to acts of collaboration, and refuse feelings of impossibility. In addition to being in conversation with my research advisors at the School of Poetic Computation, watching, listening to SoundCloud clips with Butch Morris, talking about his practice and taking notes during my Zoom calls and phone calls with Allison Bernstein, Danny Brito, my research and development came from The Art of Conduction, edited by Daniela Veronese and published by Karma in New York. The Art of Conduction serves as a comprehensive introduction and practical guide to Butch's method of conduction. The book delves into how conduction can be effectively taught, learned, and practiced in both pedagogy and performance. To conceive of music as a whole and not a category, the language is music, the vocabulary is the conduction, and music that is goal-directed and cooperative action. Conduction reconciles, contradicts, it causes circumstances, it arranges moments, and it constructs situations. These are some of the notes that Butch Morris wrote down when he was still developing what conduction was. But Butch didn't need to be specific as notation. Notation is absent of expression. The interpretation of notation needs to be broadened. It is through conduction that the break between improvisation and notation is bonded. For Morris, literal movement, or the real-time literal sonic interpretation of graphic information can be understood by the musicians and the ensemble by the alignment and orientation of the baton as it corresponds with the conductor's body. Butch talks about the significance of real-time development, taking the symbolism of notation and applying it to real-time activity. It is important to the conductor, musician, and the audience. He says that he mines music and sonic information. He mines it and then he refines it. The mining of sonic information is a real-time activity that produces a new social logic of collective imagination in the ensemble of musicians and the conductor. This particular mining is a collective intimacy, transmission, and correspondence. Butch was concerned with the process of construction that can move and turn in many ways at any given time based on the instrumentalist and in the ensemble. So here are some more quotes from that book and also from Butch's writing, where he talks about how the new requirements and scales of evaluation call for a new social logic, one that governs collective intimacy and the immediacy of creation. Why sustain the difference between notation and improvisation? And then this is a screenshot of Catherine McKittrick's book, Dear Science and Other Stories. And just to briefly give you a few lines from this footnote on reinvention, it will help you understand what I'm trying to do here. To clarify, and she quotes, "To clarify my terms, reinvention is the process through which enslaved and post-slavery, post-Black communities in the New World came to live and construct Black humanity within the context of racial violence. A range of rebellious acts that affirm Black humanity and Black life were and are imperative to reinvention. Invention is meant to signal those cultural practices and texts: maroonage, mutinies, funerals, carnivals, dramas, visual arts, fictions, poems, fights, dances, music making, and listening revolts that emerge alongside reinvented Black life. I wanted to think Butch Morris's method of conduction through a lens of reinvention. Which part of Butch's history do I need to be in dialogue with? Initially, I found myself consumed by the invention of his hand movements. I wanted to understand why Butch decided to invent this vocabulary of signs and gestures, not the written word, language, because according to Butch, music was the language and conduction was the vocabulary. What was absent in notation and written compositions for Butch that led him to invent a new social logic or an extra dimension? I should note here that improvisation alone was not enough to produce the music that Butch wanted to develop and hear. But also, I think there's something that is similar, or at least kind of aligned a bit with how Catherine McKittrick talks about reinvention in her book, Dear Science and Other Stories. And so, in the conclusion of my residency at the School for Poetic Computation and at the Kitchen, I wrote out trying to kind of combine these two ideas: Butch Morris's conduction, Catherine McKittrick's reinvention, in order to try to find how the legacy of conduction could be understood. This is a poster that I designed for the event on August 2nd, where I invited Catherine McKittrick, Melvin Gibbs, and Howard Mandel to come talk at the Kitchen at the Westbeth Gallery. And staying on that kind of idea of like, how does the legacy of conduction operate without the conductor himself, Butch Morris, I decided that perhaps it's through correspondence. And I invited H by Expanse, which is a duo of Lester St. Louis and Chris Williams, to perform at Westbeth in response to some of my research in the Kitchen's archive and thinking about Butch Morris. And then this is just an excerpt from their performance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, I don't know how the subwoofers feel out there, but they feel amazing on the stage. So thank you for that. My whole internal organs just got a massage. All right, hi, I'm Asha. I'm really grateful to be here, also a little bit nervous. So I'm gonna keep myself on task by reading some notes. I'm gonna talk about the project, the sort of outcome of the project that I did as part of this residency between the kitchen and SFPC, and then I'll talk more about why I did it, or sort of my initial question at the end. So counter-archiving the avant-garde, which is what you see on the screen, is a prototype. It's a prototype website or web platform that allows for visitor-contributed annotations to surface through primary source materials maintained in the kitchen's archive. So just to show you an example of that, I'll click on one of the pieces that's in this sort of prototype. So specifically, the web platform allows for text edits, markup, and marginalia to expand on the text pulled from primary source material in the kitchen's archive, primarily press releases and the programs for a few concerts in this prototype version. So as you scan over this text, you'll see some annotations that have been added to this primary source material. You can sort of also toggle the annotations to get a sort of sidebar companion to the original text as well. The hope was to create a platform, a sort of way of thinking about an archive that operates against the idea of an archive being a sort of guarded or static authority, or a sort of the idea that an archive is a clear representation of the past, and instead imagines the archive as something that can be dynamic, so something that changes over time, relational, so something that a variety of people can contribute to, something that's critical, and I'll get to the sort of instructional score in a second, and communal, so something that we can all gather around and talk about. I'll mention a few of the sort of theoretical touch points that were important to me as I was thinking of this project. One is Ariel Azoulay's notion of potential history, where the archive or the museum isn't just a sort of static platform for information that is the past, but rather is thought of more as a companion for us to reenact or re-understand or reimagine the past. The other idea from Ariel Azoulay is the idea, and her work is a lot about photography, and she talks about the photograph as being an instance that's documented, but there's also the absence of what was decided not to be documented, and thinking about those decisions about what's present and what's absent. So thinking about what kind of presence can we sense in the absence in archives. Another idea is one from a website called PAD.MA, Padma, which is a database of a bunch of representational non-fictional video that's been heavily text annotated. And there was a gathering in Beirut where they came up with these sort of 10 theses of an archive. And so I'll read 2 of those that were sort of key for me. Number 2, the archive is therefore not representational, it's creative. The naming of something as an archive is not the end, but the beginning of a debate. And number 6, historians have merely interpreted the archive. The point is, however, to feel it. The third idea that I'll bring into this presentation was the notion of counter-archives or counter-archiving from Brett Kashmir, a film studies person, who describes that the counter-archive represents an incomplete and unstable repository, an entity to be contested and expanded through clandestine acts, a space of impermanence and play. Taken as an action, the term entails mischief and imagination, challenging the record of official history. So I'll stop there. And then, he also says to counter-archive is to counteract, to rewrite, to animate over. So what this platform ideally allows is for folks to, let's say, you notice something that you want to comment on or cite or tag in some way, to add sort of marginalia to these official descriptions that kind of overwrite the primary source material with these sort of other possible narratives or other possible connections. Another thing I wanted to mention in terms of my set of references is Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue in part 2, where the sort of marginal text almost takes over the main text. So the footnotes kind of take over the space of the page, and it's kind of unclear which is the sort of main narrative or which is the sort of supportive information. So just another thing here in thinking about sort of this formatting of toggling between the original text and then being able to see it kind of aligned with the marginalia. So why would you want to counter-archive the kitchen's archive? So I arrived with the initial research question of thinking about the group of musicians that was sort of key in the kitchen's early years in the music community, often described as American minimalist music, who borrowed a lot from non-Western and global South sonic traditions. And I was curious about what the work of the word experimental or avant-garde was doing given that relationship of American music practice to the global South, and what I might find in the archive that pointed towards that. And so out of that came this idea, or actually this kind of frustration as I was dealing with the digital database of the kitchen archive of like how hard it was to find things and track things and kind of put my comments on things. So one of the, I guess I, in some ways kind of tried to make the thing that would have been useful for me in my research. So maybe this website could be useful to future residents. And then the other thing was just kind of thinking about how archival conventions foreclose the possibility of that reality of being able to sort of draw these connections, these more critical connections between artistic practices. So that's kind of the impetus towards moving in this direction. I want to talk about one other thing with the web platform, which is it's oriented around this 8-step instructional score. And the score is kind of to keep the spirit that I was hoping that people would arrive at this web platform with. But it's also just, there's a lot that's been talked about in terms of pedagogy, a way to have like maybe to teach people or have a discussion about what an archive does or could do. And like, for instance, if we take step 2, which is interrupt whiteness in this archive. So how does whiteness sort of reassert itself continuously in archival practices? And so how can this construction kind of generate a question around that? And then an action, an attending action within this, using text or attending media or annotated media to get at that. So the score is kind of meant to sort of guide the visitor into thinking about what an archive is, what it could do, how do I find myself within this set of material, how do I give presence to something that's peripheral but could be more central. The 7th step says to choose an instruction from the community counter archive score, which is right now a very fancy Google Doc. And then step 8 is to follow it. So there's also kind of this generativity built in. So imagining this as kind of like a discussion or workshopping tool, having people be able to build in their own ideas of what archival practice could look like, or counter-archival practice could look like, and then be able to sort of enact someone else's idea is built into those steps. Let's see. The last thing I will say are lots of thank yous, and I want to especially point out that I'm not a web designer, and so the web development was done by Talia Cotton and Chris Kim at Cotton Design, and a big thank you to them and to all of those who supported this residency. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everyone. So my name is Romy, and I just wanted to say thank you for having me here to SFPC and to the kitchen and to all the care and I think intention that went into this residency. I'm looking forward to sharing my work, songbook, The Quotient of Desire. And I'll start by giving a little bit more insight into the process, what I thought I was doing, and then kind of what I ended up doing for this residency. And so recently, a lot of my work has really been looking at histories of pattern making and pattern recognition, both those that come from the Black diaspora, such as quilting, but then also some of these histories that emerge from histories of computation themselves, such as like the kind of patterns that were so key to structuring data and information, and that are really evident in the work of people like Bella Jules, a kind of early Bell's Lab researcher. And looking at these two things together, I'm interested in what I've been calling a kind of Black computational thought, or a backward speculation, trying to unearth some of these both similarities and then divergences across how data and information get structured through something like pattern and pattern making. And in particular, I'm interested in modes of pattern making and information structuring within the Black diaspora that embrace a kind of uncertainty or a kind of errantry. And so with this residency in particular, I wanted to explore some of these notions of pattern making, particularly in improvisation and in modulation within Black sound practices. So very much thinking about improvisation as something that is about building a relationship with uncertainty and a relationship to the stochastic or to the random and emergent. And so some of the questions that I was asking are about what kinds of techniques allow uncertainty to be an instrument for Black computational thought and practice? And then also, how are certain aesthetic practices of improvisation and modulation taken up by different sound artists within the Black arts movement? And so working in the Kitchen's archive, this started to converge on the work of Julius Eastman. And so for those that are unfamiliar, he's a Black gay composer, performer, musician and vocalist who's really active from the late 60s to the mid to late 80s, and is often understood or relegated within a kind of American minimalism scene, but his work is far more vast than that. He's someone who has relationships to like Pauline Oliveros, these kinds of people. And so looking at his work, I was interested in wanting to understand how recursivity comes up in his musical arrangements, how he kind of embraces uncertainty through his use of graphic notation and graphic scores, and to think about this as a kind of experimental programming. What it means to give instructions for something that rather than trying to require kind of a cohesion or adherence to the instruction, but that allows for room to deviate or depart from it, and also brings in notions of interpretation when we're thinking about information or instruction. And so that while that's where I kind of started, once we were actually working in the Kitchen's archives, the project really shifted, and I really wanted to speak to certain absences that continued to kind of punctuate Julius Eastman's life, particularly the latter parts of it. So for the last 10 years of his life, it's really marked by moments of displacement, of houselessness, and of addiction. And although there's been like a big resurgence in celebrating his life now, during the time of him actually living, there's a lot of like veiledness about this portion of his life. And when you see people refer to it in the archives, it sometimes takes on this really pernicious trope of the kind of Black vanguard performer who is unable to kind of adhere to what's required within life. And so it becomes a very individualized story and narrative of a kind of failure. And so I kept finding that really frustrating to encounter it kind of over and over again. And so the project then became trying to understand how to build context around this portion of his life because of the absences that kind of existed in the archive. And so one of the things that I really wanted to understand was why something like addiction or houselessness would be so pervasive in New York City in the mid-1970s. And one of the things that I really found and started looking at is something called planned shrinkage. So between 1969 and 1976 being the year that Julius Eastman really relocates from Buffalo to New York City, The Rand Institute, in cooperation with the New York City Department of Housing and Development, basically devised an algorithmic model that decimated black and brown neighborhoods. It's known as plan shrinkage. And these algorithms were really used to justify immense service reductions, primarily in both densely populated but also high fire incidence neighborhoods of color. And these service reductions accelerated a kind of epidemic of fires that led to abandonment and neglect and really decimated a lot of housing stock. And so as a result, a lot of these neighborhoods were destroyed, creating a lot of forced serial displacement and migration. And it was also a kind of strategy for then expropriating this land, switching it from what was formerly residential housing into being something that's kind of geared for industrial development as a way for New York City to respond to its bankruptcy in the mid-1970s. And so the two neighborhoods in particular that were really targeted and that had the highest kind of like loss of housing were both the South Bronx and the Lower East Side. And these were really the anchors for Julius Eastman when he moved to New York City. So this context that's trying to speak to the absences in the archive around Eastman's latter life, but also trying to bring it in relationship to this computing history became the kind of goal of the project in building up this context. And so it really becomes impossible to understand Julius Eastman's life without this kind of context around planned shrinkage, housing loss, and displacement. And so then my orientation to the archive also kind of changed. So rather than looking at graphic scores, I was trying to piece together the different locations that were home to Eastman, although under really contested kind of a really contested landscape. So Eastman moved really widely throughout the city, from conservatories and performance spaces to different networks of gay bars to lovers' lofts and to clubs. And you would find these kind of anecdotes in the archive that would allude to some of these spaces, but never kind of talked about as a network of trying to find home within a kind of precariousness. And so my attempt to kind of recreate some of these spaces was to create a database and then start to kind of map them, and then to map them in relief to these kind of very targeted moments of housing loss due to planned shrinkage policies and due to the implementation of this computational model. And so that's kind of what you start to see in the map, the pink spaces being the spaces that were really decimated due to planned shrinkage, and then these like black dots being the scattering of how Eastman was moving through the city at the time. And so coming back to this focus on pattern and pattern making, I wanted to understand these different patterns as a kind of building of a network of contingent relationships. And they start to allude to this tension of what it means to push back against a boundary that kind of seeks to enclose you, and instead to try and find networks for contingent living. And so the patterns that were really derived from the maps that I was making then really become the context for creating my own kind of graphic score and the notation for that graphic score. And again, it was meant to hold the kind of tension for what those maps were alluding to around trying to find home within contingent networks, kind of pushing back against this precarity of computational modeling at the time in New York. So these are some like early kind of process drafts and sketches of like working through the score and what it might mean. And so it was derived from, again, taking some of the patterns, making notation out of them, but then also creating different types of tuning exercises so that when it was given to a performer, they can go through different modes of trying to embody that kind of tension and their relationship to home and to displacement. And so then the score itself is two-sided, again, that has notation, tuning exercises, and then something that's much more linear or could conceivably be playable by different types of musicians or artists. And so I commissioned 3 different kind of performing groups to then do interpretations of the score. So Mendy and Keith Obadike did one, Layla Naxana Chi, and then Kumi James, or who's better known as DJ Bebe. And so then that score is incorporated in a much longer songbook, which is really a way to anthologize a lot of these residues. And again, trying to build this context about Eastman's later life, and particularly speaking to the absences that were in the archive. And so this featured then different written contributions from myself, from Catherine McKittrick, Isaac Alexander Jean-Francois, George Lewis, Ron Eglish, and then Deb and Rob Wallace. And the layout of the songbook then takes on this kind of collaged, remixed, and kind of residual design in order to speak to what's necessary to build this kind of context, not all in one place, but across multiple sources. And then also reproduces certain archival photos that are in the kitchen's archive itself. And so then last month, we did a kind of book launch of the songbook, and then the commissioned artists did performances of their interpretations of the score. So these are some shots from Laila and Oksana Chi doing both a sound and dance performance. And then Kumi James also doing a kind of vocal and sound collage as well. And so after these performances, there's then a discussion about this tense notion both of what it means to create these kind of networks of contingent living, the kind of like benefit of errantry and errant pattern making, and to move outside of the ways that at least a certain history of computation seeks to kind of enclose, to categorize, and in the instances of planned shrinkage, to then expropriate and extract. And so as I close, it feels maybe a little like dissonant or disingenuous to kind of talk about this project that really features displacement and then not acknowledge a certain ethnic cleansing and the displacement that's happening in Gaza and the West Bank right now. And in working through Julius Eastman's archive in this project, I think one of the things that feels rather salient to me is this really contingent nature of life and the interdependency of it. And the interdependence of relations that are needed to really sustain life given a very precarious nature. And this is something that features both in Julius's life, but also as he thinks about composition and his scores. And so in 1980, he debuts a new series of works called Gay Guerrilla. And in that debut is really speaking to the ways that the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as well as others reify his conception of how he wants to orient to the world, and Gay Guerrilla being the way to do that. So as I close, I want to just read his quote and leave you all with a question to reflect on who you feel called to be. So as he introduces this piece, he says, quote, "Now the reason I use Gay Guerrilla, Guerrilla, that one, is because these names that either glorify them or they glorify me. And in the case of guerrilla that glorifies gay, that is to say, there aren't that many gay guerrillas, I don't feel that gaydom has and does have that strength, so therefore I use that word in the hopes that they will. You see, I feel that at this point, I don't feel that gay guerrillas can really match with Afghani guerrillas or PLO guerrillas. But let us hope in the future that they might, you see. That's why I use that word guerrilla. It means a guerrilla is someone who is, in any case, sacrificing his life for a point of view. And you know, if there is a cause, and if it is a great cause, those who belong to that cause will sacrifice themselves, because without that, there is no cause. So therefore, that is the reason that I use Gay Guerrilla, in the hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one. Thank you.
Oh, hi. Thank you to all of my panelists. It's been really lovely hearing the outcome of your work and your projects. My name is Lillian Yvonne Bertram, and I'm a poet, and I work with computation and large language models. To quote what someone from the first panel said, I'm going to use the technology that is my voice, and I'm going to describe technology, so you're going to have to use the immense powers of your imagination to kind of go along with what I'm describing. I initially encountered the kitchen's archives from a very open place, in that I didn't go in knowing what I would find. I knew that I was looking particularly for Black artists and thinkers and other BIPOC artists who were using technology in their performances in different ways. And I found a lot of things that were unexpected, and as is the case with archives, you go in looking for one thing or expecting one thing and take a lot of twists and turns and find something else. So one of the first things that I found very early on was that there was a lot of text in the archive, and I work primarily with text. And there were, if you're not familiar with the kitchen, like go to their website, thekitchen.org, shameless plug for the kitchen. There are a lot of their archives are available. But one of the things that I kept finding were a lot of press releases. And the press release is a very sort of formalized communication document, right? It's like a missive about what's going to occur and how. Does the press release always add up to what actually happens? No. But there was all of this text, and I thought, like, well, what is something that I can do with this text? And I had been working with large language models. And so I set about building, in essence, like an archive within an archive, because the press releases in the archive were not located in any particular place. They were all associated with performances. So I had to collate and put together press releases according to decades. And then I trained a large language model on these documents. And here is where you'll have to imagine that what the model ended up doing was generating press releases for speculative performances, somewhat along the lines of like Fluxus performance scores for artistic and musical performances at the kitchen that have not taken place but possibly could if someone were to attempt to stage the installation or exhibit or performance that was generated. And we tested this. I worked with a collaborator. We tested this with some out-of-the-box things like ChatGPT or other kinds of language models, and did find that the fine-tuned and trained language model performed much better than just like ChatGPT being shown a few examples. So that was one part of the project. The other part was that in looking for things in the archive, I think like some of my other panelists have mentioned, encountered a lot of frustration, right? There's a lot of gaps in the archive, a lot of things were missing. You go to look for something and the video hasn't been digitized, or it's not there, or the event was never recorded in the first place. So something I began thinking about was the inaccessibility of the archive, and how difficult it was to kind of get access to the materials. There are a lot of layers, a lot of passwords to get into a digital archive, passwords to get into a physical archive, and so on. And so I ended up working with another collaborator, Guillermo Montesinos, and together we created an app that takes, again, use your powers of imagination, and where you would stand in front of a camera and there's a still image from a performance in the archive on the screen. And when you match the pose that's being shown in the image, and there's like an overlay, there's a mask, the app uses machine learning and pose detection to then trigger that clip from the archive. And so the thinking behind this, it was to use this kind of pose detection, this archival gesture, to engage the viewer in being part of the archive, particularly to highlight performances by Black artists, to really get a visitor to the archive to engage and perform along with the work. So I don't have the app to show you, but you can imagine it, that it does in fact work. And these were things that just kind of emerged organically out of just sifting through the archive and more or less through my experience working through the archive. And I'll just end there, because I just want to keep it brief. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your projects with us. I'd like to start by thinking around the role of improvisation and how it applies to each of your practices, but also the ways in which improvisation sort of lends itself to archival research, and how you approached archival research from the lens of improvisation, if in any ways. I'd like to start.
Well, I mean, my whole project was improvised in that sense, because I didn't go into the archive with I didn't know it was in there, so I went in just thinking about like being open to what I would find, which is why like there were so many facets. There's another project that I didn't mention to what I was doing, and so in that sense it was very improvised, but also I'm in my own practice and my work as a poet, there's a lot of guesswork. which is maybe a cousin to improvisation. And I find guesswork to be very fruitful.
I can go next. Yeah, I think at the outset of the residency, I had a lot of big ideas and I had a lot of ambitions of different artists and performances that I wanted to work with. But, you know, following what you said about this encounter of like the archive, your project and your ideas quickly changed because you realize that being on the floors of an archive, there's not the visual information that you may be looking for, but instead a lot of emails that have been printed out for some reason. There's a lot of press releases. There's a lot of different types of texts that don't lend themselves to perhaps the aesthetics that one might want to work with for a presentation like this. And so there was a lot of improvising on my end with, you know, who I could work with and who I could continue to be in dialogue with in the Kitchens archive. So what ended up happening was improvisation was like the word that I just followed, and the easiest way to track it was through Butch Morris's practice and also through Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science and Other Stories, because it was just continuing to come up as I was reading them next to each other. So I guess improvising in the archive was really well suited for this residency for me. Even going back and forth at WOVO and inviting people to talk with and hearing their thoughts all felt like it was off the cuff, really.
I think I have a kind of similar experience of, I work mostly with sound, and so I expected that I would do a lot of research and then respond through sound. I didn't anticipate building something more like a tool. So, you know, in that sense, yes, definitely improvise, but I think there's also sort of something similar about how I like to work with sound, which is like listening through, I'm mostly working outside of like music or tonality when I work with sound, and so a lot of like the choices that I make are guided through something embodied. So the sort of frustration, I guess, of like looking for things and not finding them, or kind of understanding how the structures of databases like foreclose sort of narrative possibilities or ways of understanding history, like that feeling, I think still the way it manifests, like that feels like kind of how I work with any sort of other artistic medium, I guess.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I would say has been said, but the maybe like additional thing that came up in the work, so I talked about improvisation as being this relationship to uncertainty or unknown, and as people are saying, when you're working in the archive, there are a lot of gaps, and so the question becomes really quickly, how do I want to respond to this gap or to this absence? Sometimes there's like a desire or impetus to then fill the gap and fill it with information or correct it. I think there's also sometimes a question of not maybe how to fill, but rather how to just recognize and like explain kind of context more than like fill it with information. And I think that relationship to improvisation is really important, that it's not a kind of untethered like speculative act, but that it still has this kind of responsibility to like the material and to the context. And so that became kind of the method then for working in the archives, was not to speculate in the absence of something, but for me to try and just build the context around it. So it's not trying to answer necessarily a question of what happens with Eastman's life, but it's trying to kind of insert something that's unavoidable that needs to then be the kind of like lens through which we see something.
Yeah, I really like the idea of gesturing towards a history or gesturing towards a question or a point of inquiry. And I think each of you has sort of spoken about this in different ways, but with your experiences working in the archives, there seem to have been, you know, a lot of natural gaps. And I'm curious to hear from each of you about the kinds of questions you would have wanted answered.
Well, I found myself often asking, why wasn't this recorded? Like, and I'm sure the answers to that are various. But not just like why wasn't something documented and recorded, but why other things were. So just sort of like who was thinking what around how to build an archive, and who were they thinking would access it, right? If anyone at all. And then like what would it mean to set out to build an archive with accessibility in mind, as opposed to like trying to fashion some kind of accessibility organization after the fact. So for me, it raised a lot of questions about the nature of archiving in general.
I think being in the physical space of the archive brought up a lot of questions about like the unevenness of an archive. There's a lot of imbalance that happens, and that brought up new questions and ways to think about like how does an artist engage or respond to an institution's archive. For example, I was really excited to work with Tracy Morris's practice, but what I ended up discovering was a lot of email correspondence and a lot of contracts that could have potentially been really useful if I wanted to go in that direction. And the stack of their particular archive was drastically different to the two pieces of paper that were in Butch Morris's archive. And so the question is like, what systems are in place to allow that to happen, right? Why, like, what roles does, people who are working with a particular institution, not just the kitchen, where there can be the uneven distribution of the documentation or the recording of one artist's archive to the next. And after having conversations, I think, with you, Danny, and Allison, who's not here today, but it really is dependent on like who is working during that decade or that year, and the relationship that they want to have with documentation, with one particular performance. And you'll see that there will just be faxes and faxes with everything that had to do with that artist or had to do with that project. But then the following month, there's like almost little to nothing in development or documented from another person's project. So yeah, I think just like the question of like how do we develop new systems or new organizational practices so that that doesn't take place.
A small thing I can add to that is kind of wondering who else has done archival work. Like who else has touched these papers and what did they find and what were they thinking or what were they looking for? And I guess I mentioned that kind of connecting that with something that Tara Rogers, who's an electronic musician and wrote the book Pink Noises, said about, this is something Tara said about the film that came out sort of recently called Sisters with Transistors, which is like a very sort of cis-white re-retelling of the sort of unspoken history of electronic music, and Tara said, like how many times do we tell this version of this history before it becomes history? And yeah, kind of thinking about like, so I guess a question I have that wasn't answered is like, what other kinds of questions or what are the questions that I'm asking that other people have already asked with this material, and what kind of answers did they come up with, and wouldn't it be nice to like see what they found?
Yeah, I think, sorry, your question was, what's a question we had that we wish was answered? I think it's something along the lines of, what's the responsibility an arts organization has to an artist's life beyond the labor that they produce, and valuing something beyond that labor in their lifetime? Because what's so shocking about Eastman's file is that the file that's there that pertains to his life when he was like actively engaging with the kitchen is really slim, right? There's not a lot there. And as people are remarking, a lot of what's in the archive are the kind of administrative correspondences that reflects then like what was valuable to archive from the kitchen's perspective. But Eastman's file is, again, really thin. What's really thick are then the like revisiting of Eastman's work after he's passed. And then there's all kinds of reproductions of that documentation that gives a lot of celebration of his life, but in his lifetime it's really thin. So it's this question of beyond just extraction or celebration of labor, what is the responsibility that the institution holds to the artist?
Yeah, that's a great one, and one I found myself asking a lot when I was working with the kitchen's archives is this question of how do we construct the production of knowledge and what's considered knowledge and what's not. I think I found often that I was most excited to see the sort of like interpersonal mapping that was happening through the archive. So finding out that Butch Morris was performing with so-and-so or so-and-so, and like thinking about ways that these kind of underground communities and alternative ecosystems were being formed in real time. This is sort of zooming out a bit, because I know that we're a bit over time. This is my last question before we open it up to Q&A. But sort of the starting point for this residency was the concept of Black Gooey Universe, as American noted and created the concept. And this idea emerges from the thought that technological interfaces, technologies, and computation as a whole is embedded with a kind of critical discourse, even though technology as it's constructed is sort of meant to be neutral or conditioned to be neutral, right? I'm curious for each of you, in what ways does this kind of tension between technology and critical discourse show up in your practice, if in any ways?
I guess I can start. Yeah, it feels rife throughout. I don't know another way to answer it. I think part of what you're like alluding to is a question of what gets qualified and standardized as counting as technology and is somehow removed from having any kind of context or origin or anything else. So we will confine it to tool, and then this will be the enclosed way that we understand computing. It'll be the enclosed way that we understand technology, and anything kind of adverse to that framing is non-technological or non-computational, et cetera. And I guess in my work, I'm trying to refuse that enclosure around what counts as computation or technology. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is to, again, build the context for how that standardization came to be. And then that's why pattern making, pattern recognition become these more transferable concepts or lenses to look at other types of practice of information storage or sharing that are not about replicating the same kinds of enclosed standardizations when we talk about data or digital computing. So they're always kind of one and the same. I find it very difficult to extract them really neatly or cleanly.
I would say that, throughout my time at the residency, this question that you're bringing up was not directly answered through a lens of computation, but something that felt particularly close was Butch Morris's, I think, tension with notation and improvisation. On the one hand, I think it's important for me to understand, and when I talk about his career, it's that he wasn't just wanting to depend on improvisation as a tool, because it too needs a lot of guidance and structure in its delivery. But also there was this kind of pushing back against notation, which I think at times can feel neutral or sometimes can feel like a standardization of how we understand music making, composition making. And for him to try to put those two things together and also create this new social logic, as he calls it, this vocabulary, as I want to call it, does, I think, try to, just a little bit tease at this question that you're bringing up.
I guess, I mean, as a writer, I use computation in my work. Not regularly, but I have in the past. But I've also used the quote-unquote technology of computation without computers. So similar to kind of like what you were saying, Romy, like with a technology that's not as boxed or as rigidly defined, but thinking more expansively about what can be a technology has always been part of my writing practice in particular.
The sort of wandering thought that I have, which is maybe sort of disconnected from your question, has less to do with what I have done in the past, but more like I think something that the project that I did for the residency, as well as kind of what I'm thinking in the future, has to do with, which is like, how do we gain a sense of truth? Lofty question, but like, and kind of big umbrella question about like when we're presented with facts of the past, how do we develop relationships with those facts and develop a sense of truth out of that? And so thinking of archives and or thinking of really like any information that we're presented with through our whatever technologies. How are we asked to engage with them, and how does that contribute to like the senses of truth that we come away with?
Thank you. I think are we still gonna open it up to Q&A or no? Okay. Well, thank you.